At my wife's company gala, her work friend joked that she deserves a real man after hours. The table roared. Even my wife smiled. I said nothing, until he bragged about his position. Then I pulled out my phone and watched every smile at that table disappear instantly. Her name was Diane. Mine is not important yet. But his name was Preston, and the way he raised his glass that night told me everything I needed to know about a man who had never once been held accountable for anything he said. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened inside that ballroom. I am not a man who moves quickly. I never have been. Every decision I have ever made in my adult life has been slow, deliberate, and designed to land exactly where I aimed it. I learned that from watching people like Preston operate for years. They talk loudly, they fill rooms, they make everyone around them feel small or grateful or both, and then they walk away clean because nobody ever built the infrastructure to stop them. I spent 3 years building that infrastructure. 3 years of silence, patience, and very careful paperwork, all while Diane laughed at company dinners and touched the arm of a man who told jokes at my expense before I had even finished sitting down. I had been with Diane for 14 years, 12 of them married. I drove her to 2 surgeries, one in the middle of a January ice storm when the roads had not been cleared, and I gripped that steering wheel for 40 minutes straight with nothing but the sound of her shallow breathing in the passenger seat to keep me focused. I moved cities twice for her career, packing boxes, leaving friendships, resetting my own professional trajectory each time without complaint. I missed dinners, holidays, weekends, and late birthdays. All of it surrendered to build something she never once thought to ask about. Not out of resentment, at least not at first, but because I had learned, quietly and over time, that the thing you build in silence is the only thing nobody can take credit for. While she climbed her firm's ladder and soaked in the applause of people like Preston, I built a silent ownership stake in a shell conglomerate called Varon Capital Holdings. Varon had no website you could find without a private access key. No signage anywhere, no lobby with a logo, no press releases buried somewhere in a business journal, but it held 39.4% of pending assets in the acquisition trail of her exact firm. In 2 months, pending a board vote, that number would jump to 51%. Varon had no public face, just documents, clauses, and one encrypted app on my phone connected to a review server that only 2 other people in the world could access. I paid $900,000 to structure that deal correctly. I paid an additional $240,000 in legal fees alone to keep my name buried 3 layers deep inside, holding entity language that would take a forensic accountant the better part of a month to untangle. Nobody at that table had any idea. That was entirely by design. The Callaway Grand was the kind of venue that reminded wealthy people why they worked hard enough to be invited to places like it. 14-foot ceilings with crown molding painted in ivory and gold, a floor that reflected candlelight back up at you like still water. The waitstaff moved between tables in dark uniforms, silent and precise, refilling glasses before anyone thought to ask, removing plates before the conversation noticed them. Her firm called it their annual investor relations night, their one opportunity per year to stand in front of the people who held their future and perform confidence so thoroughly that nobody stopped to examine the books too closely. Round tables dressed in white linen, centerpieces built from white orchids and black candles. The kind of room that was designed to make everyone in it feel like they had already won. She had introduced me to the table as just a guest, not her husband, not her partner of 14 years. Not the man who had rerouted his entire professional life twice so she could stand in this room wearing that dress. Just a guest. I noted that. I folded it carefully and set it somewhere I would not forget it. Then I said nothing, pulled out my chair, and sat down. Preston was already 3 glasses deep when he made his joke. He was broad-shouldered in the way that men who peaked in their mid-30s sometimes are, carrying the physical confidence of old athleticism over a foundation that had softened. His cufflinks were ostentatious. His watch was louder than his voice, which was already very loud. He had been performing since before we sat down, working the table like a room he owned, leaning back in his chair at an angle that said he never worried about what anyone thought of him, which I have learned is always the most dangerous kind of lie a man tells himself. The joke came mid-sentence, dropped casually into a story he was already telling about a conference in Scottsdale. He turned toward Diane, gestured at her with his glass, and said it with the grin of someone who had said it before and been rewarded for it before. He said a woman who worked as hard as Diane absolutely deserved a real man after hours. The table erupted, not politely, not with the restrained chuckle of people who knew better. They roared, the kind of laughter that is really just the sound of everyone deciding at once that they are safe to be cruel because the most powerful person in their immediate vicinity just signaled that cruelty was the currency of the evening. I watched Diane lean into his shoulder. Not a subtle lean, a deliberate one, the kind that contains a message. She was smiling, and it was not the smile she reserved for things she found genuinely funny. It was the smile she used when she needed someone to know she was on their side. I have seen it directed at other people in other rooms many times. Sitting 3 feet from it that night was a different kind of education. I did not flinch. I sipped my water. The ice tapped the rim of the glass with a small, clean sound that I focused on for exactly 3 seconds. No wine for me that evening. I had decided that before we left the house. I wanted to remember every word spoken at that table, every gesture, every name, the exact sequence of who laughed and how long they laughed and whether they looked at me afterward. I wanted all of it recorded with perfect clarity in a place Preston could not reach. He kept talking. Louder, with every sentence, the way men do when the room keeps rewarding them. He told the table that the board had basically begged him to lead the upcoming integration deal. He described it as a matter of trust, of cultural alignment, of the investor behind the acquisition needing someone at the operational helm who understood how the firm actually worked from the inside. He said that person was him. He used the word obvious. He touched the knot of his tie when he said it, a small reflex of vanity that I catalogued without expression. Diane practically melted beside him. She touched his arm with 3 fingers, let them rest there for a moment that lasted longer than professional warmth required, and told him the firm was genuinely lucky to have someone like him in a moment like this. He smiled with his whole face and said he tried to stay humble about it. The woman across the table, whose name was Greta and who managed their Eastern regional accounts, said that humility was practically his brand. Nobody laughed harder than the people who needed something from him. That is the truest thing I can tell you about rooms like that one. I let him finish. I let him sit in the warm approval of that table for another full minute while he described his vision for post-integration leadership, his plans for restructuring 2 departments whose names he said with casual authority, the relationship he had already begun building with what he called the acquisition side. He had no idea he was describing in specific operational detail a structure that I had reviewed line by line in a document sitting on a server I controlled. He had no idea that the 2 months he was treating as his runway were actually the last 2 months of the version of this firm where Preston held any meaningful position at all. That is when I reached into my jacket pocket. Not quickly, not with theater. There was no dramatic pause, no moment where I looked around the table to make sure I had an audience. I simply reached in with the calm of someone retrieving something they have been carrying all evening, which I had been. The phone was warm from sitting close to me. It unlocked with 1 scan of my thumb. I opened the app, 1 button on a plain white screen, no logo, no company name, just a single line of text. I tapped it once. Then I set the phone face down on the table between my water glass and the bread plate and folded my hands. 1 signal, sent to 2 devices inside that building. Both carried by people who had been in that room since the doors opened, waiting quietly for exactly that moment, drawing no attention, drinking nothing stronger than sparkling water, doing what professionals do when they are paid to be invisible until they are not. Preston was still talking. Diane was still smiling. Her hand was still on his arm. Across the ballroom, at a corner table that had been positioned to face the room without being noticed by it, a man in his late 60s rose from his chair without urgency. His suit was charcoal and immaculately tailored, cut close enough to signal taste without announcing it. His hair was silver and combed back from a face that held the particular stillness of someone who had been in difficult rooms many times and found all of them manageable. He set his napkin on the table. He adjusted his cufflinks once. Then he turned and walked toward the executive corridor that ran behind the main ballroom toward the private meeting suite the hotel reserved for guests whose arrangements required discretion. His name was Edmund Voss. He did not appear on the guest list for that evening because the guest list was a prop, a document that existed to manage the front of house, and Edmund Voss had not needed to manage a front of house in 2 decades. He carried more real authority than every executive sitting in that ballroom combined, and he had agreed to be present that night as a professional courtesy to me, which was the only kind of courtesy Edmund Voss extended to anyone. The second device that received my signal belonged to a woman named Carolyn Marsh, who had been sitting 4 tables away in a black dress that cost more than most people in that room made in a month. Carolyn was Varen's legal director. She was the person who had spent 11 months building the document architecture that kept my name 3 layers deep inside language that would exhaust any attorney who tried to chase it. She stood when Edmund stood, and she walked the same direction, carrying a slim leather portfolio under one arm that contained, among other things, the summary disclosure package that would be delivered to the firm's board chair before close of business the following Monday. Preston had moved on to a new story, something about a ski house in Telluride and a closing dinner that had apparently become legendary among people who were not at the table I was sitting at. He was gesturing with his fork now. Diane had not moved her hand from his arm. The door at the far end of the executive corridor opened and closed with a sound no one at the main tables could have heard over the noise of the room. But I heard it. Or perhaps I simply knew the exact second it would happen because I had designed the exact second it would happen, and there is a particular kind of quiet that settles inside you when something you built over 3 years of silence finally begins to move. I picked up my phone. I turned it face up. I opened a different application, one that displayed a live feed from the private suite upstairs where the firm's board chair, a man named Gerald Fitch, had been pulled from the cocktail reception 40 minutes earlier by his personal assistant with a message that described an urgent matter requiring his immediate attention. Gerald was in that suite. Edmund was walking toward it. Carolyn was already inside, seated, portfolio open, the disclosure summary centered on the table in front of an empty chair. I set the phone flat on the table with the screen visible and let it sit there. Preston noticed the screen first. Not because he knew what he was looking at, but because a screen visible at a dinner table during a story about Telluride is the kind of social disruption that people like Preston register as a challenge to their performance. He glanced at it, then at me, and his expression carried the particular annoyance of someone who had not yet decided whether I was worth acknowledging directly. I looked at him for the first time that evening with something other than studied indifference. I looked at him the way you look at something you have been patient about for a very long time. I said his name. Just his name. The way you say it when you do not need anything else to follow it. The table went quiet faster than I expected. I told him that the integration deal he had described leading was in fact already structured, already resourced, and already assigned to an operational framework that had been filed with 2 separate legal entities 4 weeks prior. I told him that the investor he had referenced, the one the board had supposedly selected him to work with based on cultural trust, had a name he did not know. I told him the investor held 39.4% of pending firm assets today, and that number would move to controlling majority in approximately 63 days, pending a routine board confirmation that was, by that point, not actually routine at all. I told him the investor was me. I did not say it loudly. I said it the way you say something when you have waited long enough that saying it feels less like triumph and more like completing a task you started a long time ago. The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of a room recalibrating. I watched it move around the table the way silence does when it is carrying information too large for any single face to hold. Greta, who had called Preston's humility his brand, looked down at her plate. The man to Preston's left, whose name I never learned, pushed back almost imperceptibly in his chair. Preston himself did not move at all. His glass was still raised slightly from the last gesture of his last story, held there at a height that no longer made any sense for anything. Diane removed her hand from his arm. That gesture, that small and quiet withdrawal, was the thing I had not fully prepared for, because even when you build something this carefully, even when you know exactly how the documents read and exactly what the timeline looks like and exactly where every person in the room will be standing when the signal goes, there are still moments that arrive with a weight that planning cannot fully account for. I watched her look at me with an expression that moved through several different things in the space of 3 seconds, and I held her gaze without moving. I told the table that Edmund Voss, who was at that moment upstairs with Gerald Fitch and Carolyn Marsh, would be presenting the formal disclosure to the board chair that evening. I told them that the operational restructuring Preston had described so confidently would proceed on a timeline and under a leadership structure that had not yet been announced, but that would be announced within the week. I told them that the role Preston had described as essentially his had not been assigned to anyone at that table. I picked up my phone, stood, and buttoned my jacket. I looked at Diane one more time. I told her I hoped she had enjoyed the evening. I told her the car was paid for and would wait for her until midnight. Then I told her she should find herself an attorney she trusted, not one connected to the firm, and that she should do that this week rather than next. I walked out of the Callaway Grand through the front entrance, past the coat check, past the valets who moved aside without being asked, and out into the cold night air. I stood on the front steps for a moment and breathed in the kind of quiet that follows 14 years of patience arriving all at once. The city continued its noise at the edges of the block. The doors behind me did not open. 3 weeks later, the board vote confirmed Varen's majority position. Preston was not assigned to the integration. He resigned the following Friday with a statement so brief it barely qualified as a sentence. Diane retained an attorney, a good one, and we began a process that was not easy, but was, at least, honest. My name, for the record, is Marcus, and I want you to understand something. I did not build Varen Capital Holdings to destroy anyone. I built it the same way I built everything else in my life, slowly, quietly, and without anyone watching, because I had learned a long time ago that the only power worth holding is the kind that cannot be taken away in a room that was never meant for you to begin with. I was always in that room. They simply forgot to look.